Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. We are in, Bob, I'm not even sure how to describe the series we're in, but what I can say is I love the people we've had on. So I feel like we're all over the place in this series, but you're the mastermind with this stuff. So what are we even going to call this series so we can set up our final guest in the series?
Yeah, I've been wondering that myself. I don't know if we've come up with a title. I guess before we produce it, we will have a title. But,
yeah, that's true.
It's spiritual discernment and deliverance, maybe. I don't know.
Okay, cool.
I don't know how that
the spiritual stuff. Yeah, yeah. We're in the spiritual stuff. So I'm very excited about our guest today, Father Boniface Hicks. Father Boniface, this is the funny thing. I feel like, I don't know why this picture came to mind, but you and I know each other quite well. And so I feel like if you know a sports team and you think like an elementary sports team, and there's the kid who clearly shouldn't be on the team, but he's on the team and he's just happy to run. I feel like that guy when I'm around you. Like, I just feel like the guy who's like, I don't even know what we're really doing. I think I know how to play the sport that we're doing, but it's sure fun. You know? And like, you're doing all the real things, just being kind and going, okay, go shoot the ball now. I've set everything up for you. I've guarded all the guys for you. Sorry, my silly sports analogy, but Father Boniface, thanks so much for being with us. We're really grateful that you are here.
Well, thanks. It's really a pleasure and a privilege. I know you, of course, very well, and I've gotten to know Dr. Bob directly and indirectly very well, and just have a great deal of love and admiration for both of you. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Listeners, Father Boniface is a special man, and so there's resources galore that you can type them on YouTube. But if you're like, okay, well, I'm interested, and you're right in the middle of the episode, you go, okay, I want to find out more. I got to go see what he's written. There's several, I would say, critical books that he's written. One on spiritual direction, one on prayer, another on St. Joseph. And Father, I don't mean to insult you if you've written others, but those are like, to me, the benchmarks that I look to and have been deeply impacted by. And I have priests that I've formed in my diocese that reference your books, not knowing you're in my relationship. And they're like, have you ever heard of Father Boniface in this book? I'm like, yeah, those are great, aren't they? Like, I'm fond of those books myself. So listeners, just awesome stuff for you to go and check out. And Father, you do like spiritual direction training, and there's a whole website around that. Can you just tell us, and we'll get all this stuff and I'll remind everybody at the end. What's the spiritual direction place that they can contact you? Or
So I'm the director for something called the Institute for Ministry Formation at St Vincent Seminary. And so our website is related to those things. IMF, like Institute for Ministry Formation, and then everything's spelled out, stvincentseminary.edu.
No, even ST.
No, everything's spelled out. Yep, SAINT.
Yeah.
And we're just about to renovate our website. So if you dial into this before the end of 2022, don't judge us, and come back at the beginning of 2023, and that'll be nicer. But we do run spiritual direction formation, and we have some other programs and other online offerings, and a lot of ways to connect with the kind of community we're forming. We consider ourselves sort of an outreach of St. Vincent Seminary. Sharing St. Vincent Seminary with the rest of the church is one of our taglines.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, you got a little bit of this Pittsburgh Steeler charism in that. Because they train there.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, I've actually been there, and that was really cool to watch Ben Roethlisberger throw on the field, and I was like, "This is crazy! This is so cool." Yeah. Anyway, so Father, I mean, there's just so many. Your people will see your picture, and your Heather has said it too about you, and I'm going to embarrass you, but she said he's like a monk in his bones, because you look at him and he's obviously a Benedictine monk, but you look at his face and it's like you can tell that man has spent many an hour before the Blessed Sacrament. It's almost like Jesus's countenance has been infused into your countenance. And I have to say, it's a wonderful thing to behold you on a regular basis. And so okay, done embarrassing you. Let's get into the topics about why we're here. Yeah. Well, maybe a little bit of background is really cool. Your story was wild. Like you didn't grow up Catholic.
No, I went to Penn State as an unbaptized atheist when I was 17. When I was 18, a total stranger invited me to study the Bible with him one-on-one. When I was 19, I would have considered myself a Christian. And when I was 21, I was baptized Catholic. When I was 22, I entered the monastery.
Yeah.
That's the short timeline.
The short version.
And when were you ordained?
And then I was ordained in priest in 2004.
So at what age was that?
Oh, sorry, 28.
28. Okay, so 7 years after. Okay.
But you have like your doctorate in computer science, right?
After I was ordained a priest, I went back to Penn State and helped in campus ministry, and then got a doctorate in computer science. I had a master's when I entered the monastery from my initial studies. And then I moved on from computer science after teaching a few years at our college. We have a college with a full set of undergraduate degrees. And then I've really plunged I became the director of spiritual formation in the seminary. I also helped to found a radio network. I worked in that exclusively for about 6 years, and then started doing spiritual formation in the seminary. And
all that comes from that. Yeah. Sorry, there's so much that you and I've talked about that I'll try to trim myself down here. But Father, you've been one of the guests I've been most excited to come on, because you're in my ongoing conversations. We don't ever talk about computer science. Well, maybe like one or twice, just joking around about it or whatever. But I feel like you're somebody who I turn to go, I don't understand blank. Help me understand blank. And your capacity to draw on the rich history of the church, as well as secular sources that are worth entertaining, and what I call baptizing those secular sources, basically leaving what isn't true and bringing in what is true. So as we keep zooming in here about the specific topics we're hoping to talk to you about, is I have experienced the capacity you have to integrate all kinds of different things, because you do formation for seminarians, you do human, spiritual, pastoral, and intellectual formation, the 4 pillars for seminarians, but you're also well versed in all kinds of other things. Like we joke around that you're a tradismatic, or however that goes, which I never heard the phrase, and I was like, I love that. Like the ability to integrate what's typically polarizing for a Catholic living their faith, or even a Christian living their faith. You've integrated so much of that, and it's so refreshing, because you're not really bothered by either camp, right? You get it. You're like, no, I understand where they're coming from, and here I see the good, and vice versa. So if we keep zooming in, we've had guests on before you, and I think Bob in his wisdom knew, let's let Father Boniface be here, because of your capacity to integrate and discuss. So we're just going to start throwing things at you to let you do your thing. But we've had Father Timothy Gallegron, who does Ignatian rules of discernment and discernment. And then we've had Father Justin Brady on, who's an exorcist and has done lots in his history with inner healing and his personal background. Then we had the Lozanos on, talking about unbound ministry. And now we're having you on, who's spiritual director, formator, spiritual director, etc. I think I'm just setting the stage for the listeners, because, all right, what are we doing here? I think we're going to be trying to weave together just ideas and concepts and images. Bob, what would you say? Just initial thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, I think you said that well, Jake, as we're trying to, I think Father Boniface and the conversations we've had together, you really bring these things together well in application, both in teaching and then in spiritual direction and in formation. So just maybe start with your experience with each of those, with Ignatian spirituality, with inner healing, exorcism, deliverance, unbound, and maybe your experience with each of those before we get into the practical questions.
Yeah, thanks for all the kind words. And I would like to include, because it's also important to me, the integration with those three individuals that you said, who I know to varying degrees and really admire and appreciate. And also with you both in your integration of these things together with psychology, which has been really important to me. And so I love to, as you've indicated, I love to collect things and synthesize them. And
Yeah, and where we met was related to theology of the body, so that also has been a big part of formation. Yeah.
Yes, I meet people, connect, synthesize. I've come to really appreciate the Strength Finders assessment, and my number one is input, number two is learner, number three is connectedness. So it's sort of the package that you were just describing there a little bit earlier. Yeah. Input is about collecting things and organizing them to share them, and then the connectedness comes in there in terms of the people and you're so right. And I don't know. I guess I hope it's Catholic too, in the sense of being really universal to the whole. There's just so much richness that we have to specialize, of course. I mean, we don't go deeper unless we specialize to a certain degree, but it's such a blessing to be in conversation with experts in different areas and to really come to an appreciation for those different specializations without losing sight of the whole. So, yeah, I came to know, I learned Ignatian discernment of spirits from Father Gallagher, and then I've been teaching it to the seminarians and in large, a 10-hour course, and then teaching it to my spiritual direction students in bits and pieces. One of the things I really appreciate about Ignatius is he gives us a way to describe when God is speaking to us. We can feel that sometimes. When God is giving grace, sometimes, not all the time, it's a felt grace. And Ignatius gives us a description of the feelings that go with that: our hearts inflamed with love, spiritual joy, moved to tears, increase in faith, increase in hope, stillness, inner peace. These are signs that we can detect in our bodies that God is impressing his word on us. And it goes back to the beginning of my own journey. I gave you in real rapid fashion my movement from meeting a stranger to being a monk. And in the middle of that was an encounter with the Lord, which happened. I can have the language for it now. I had a spiritual consolation at a difficult time when I was studying in Germany. I believed in God, but I didn't have a relationship. I didn't even know what a relationship with him was. But I prayed. And then I really felt his presence. There was deep peace, inner stillness, an increase in faith, an increase in hope. And there were words that came, and I felt like I could have a communication in all of the obscurity of the ways that we communicate in faith. And then I tried to describe that for years to people, like, well, when God's talking to you, when God is close to you, you want to make a decision when you can hear him. And then like, well, how do I know I'm hearing him? How do I know that he's close to me? I'm like, I am, and then what did I have to draw on but my own experience? And so I tried to describe that. But in discovering Ignatius, and especially the way that Father Gallagher presents him so beautifully, it's like, oh, here is a list of possibilities that we can pay attention to in our bodies. And I just found that to be such a valuable resource to make a little bit more concrete and also span the range of people's experiences. A lot of people have picked up that peace is good, but sometimes, lose track of tears or joy or what an increase in hope or an increase in faith looks like. So I just love that. And how do I know the word is from the Lord? Well, if it's coming together with spiritual consolation, then we're working on something. We've got something to get our hands around. And then, like, the opposite as well with spiritual desolation, we can feel those things in our bodies, all of the opposite, drawn to low and earthly things, distracted, tepid, sad, as if separated from our Creator and Lord, lack of faith, lack of hope. So, and then when words are coming there, well, we want to be suspicious about those words because they're more likely coming from the enemy. And so it gives us some tools in our humanity. And if I can put a big sign on things that are really important to me for integrating things Christian. One of them is humanity. Jesus became human, truly human. And human means not an angel. An angel doesn't have a body and doesn't have emotions and doesn't have an imagination. Humans
Mm,
have bodies, emotions, senses, imaginations.
mm,
And I love humanity because Jesus loves
mm,
humanity. God loved humanity enough to become one with us, and he lived it to the last breath. He never took a get out of jail free card to escape our humanity. And
mm,
so I think really reverencing humanity, and that's why I love, both of you in psychology, and I've really gotten a lot from things like the body keeps the score and different psychological
mhm,
models like internal family systems, and Conrad Bars I love very much, who has such a good integrated sense of emotions together with the importance of relationships and
mm,
all those nice Thomistic categories.
mm.
So I love those things about St. Ignatius and his teaching. And well, maybe I'll just pause there.
It's so good. It's so good. Because I think what you're expressing is a beautiful summary, and I have a hunch of where we're going to go here in in the conversation, which is starting to get into the whys and hows and whats of, how do I know which tool to pull off the shelf? What do I do in these particular scenarios? There's the practicals are intense, but I feel like I'm about to ask a dangerous question because, Bob, this is off script, but we don't really ever have scripts, but our little 3-point script. Father, I've wanted to ask because I feel like this is so important as a preface to the stuff we're going to summarize and all the stuff we're doing with this particular episode, and so here's the question. How does a soul change? Why I'm asking it is because if we understand souls and bodies in humans, and maybe we'd broaden that out to how do humans change, then we understand when something goes wrong, or we have now context, right? This is the base understanding in my mind for, discernment of spirits. Well, why does that even happen? Or why do I even need to do deliverance ministry? Why do I need spiritual direction? Why do I do Unbound? There's this premise that feels really important to articulate so that the whole thing has context, including psychology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have no idea how hard of a question that is. I imagine it's not easy, but if there's a person who I'd want to ask it to, you would be the one. And the fun part is I gave you no preface or inkling that I was going to ask you this question. And again, like emotions, is that like part of my soul? And how does that change through experience? Is that the only way? And I know I'm asking you to do a doctoral thesis in 5 minutes, but anyway.
I didn't think about it until you asked the question, but you did mention that when you originally asked me to be on the podcast. And I remember thinking, I don't like that question.
Well, here it is again. That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm really going to be thinking off the top of my head, speaking off the top of my head. But I think there are a few moving parts there. So, and understanding the basic teaching of the theology of the body, that the body is the language of the soul.
Hmm.
And then let me talk about language for a moment. If we can't speak, we can't think. So we think in language, and until we have language, we don't think. So the fuller our language is, the better our thinking is. It's one of the points that Jordan Peterson brings out that I like very much. And he says, why do you write papers in college? Not so that you can be assessed. You write papers in college so you can learn how to think. Because if you can't speak, if you can't write, if you don't have grammar, if you don't have vocabulary, then it prevents you from thinking. So, so the language of our thoughts, our actual grammar and English and things like that, are important for the soul growing. Our thinking, of course, is tied in with the intellect and at various levels. But in terms of our bodies also, if we're going to express love, then developing the emotional capacities that we need to love and to be loved, that also has to grow. And so as babies, we don't have the capacity to love in the same way as we do as adults. If there's something meaningful about Jesus being 33 when he fully expresses God's love in his total self-emptying on the cross, so our bodies form, and this is where my eclecticism. How do I describe the body? And the church hasn't really baptized a single anthropology. There are things that have to be there, but I think there are different ways to describe that. Certainly, the Thomistic model is that there's a material part of the soul, and that would include the external senses, the unifying sense, the cogitative sense, the imagination, the memory, in terms of intellect. And then there's also the appetites, which are broken into the passions. Then there's also the immaterial part of the soul, which is the intellect that's able to form concepts and moral judgments, and then the will that makes choices. And those are purely spiritual parts of the soul. But it's really, I would say, a kind of artificial separation, other than
Hmm.
the absurd state of death in which body and soul are separated, but the soul still exists in some form, which even St. Thomas had a difficult time describing. Really, we don't know a human soul, except as it's expressed through a body. And so you
Hmm.
really have a lot of integration of that spiritual part and the material part. And if the material part is badly damaged, that it's going to limit the development. I would say this is where I'm starting to wander into territories where there are experts and I'm not one, but it's going to limit the development of that more purely spiritual part. So to summarize that in more accessible language, our emotions have to grow, our senses grow. St. Thomas, it's the foundation of Montessori education that,
Hmm.
until our senses really form, our thinking doesn't form, and we don't form abstractions, but you do everything in a fully sensory way. The more that the senses are able to develop, the more that the imagination is able to develop, the more that we're able to feel and our bodies develop, then our concepts and our abstractions and our reason and everything else develops in accord with that. And
Hmm.
so developmentally appropriate, but really filling the senses with experience is important for the whole person to grow. And we can see that in Jesus. He didn't exclude himself from that. How does
Hmm.
he grow? He doesn't grow in divine knowledge, and he doesn't grow in infused knowledge, which is the pouring of his divine knowledge into his humanity. He grows in experiential knowledge. He doesn't know
Hmm.
the experience of being human until he has the experience of being human. Experience is only something
Hmm.
you must subjectively go through. It's not something that can be infused from without. And so
Hmm.
he grows in wisdom and grace and before God and men, as it says in the scriptures a couple of times. But
Hmm.
he does that with a mother and a father who are able to form him. And he does that in a village and with real experiences. And his humanity has to grow, and as our humanity also grows.
Hmm. Bob, I'm going to pass the next question over to you in a second, but I'm going to summarize what I'm hearing you say is, Father, I'm hearing you say, and I'm massively simplifying it, there are a lot of components to being human, which is body and soul, and all those components are interworking. As soon as you start pulling one aside, you can't do that without affecting all of the others. And so, as we here in a moment start shifting to, well, why would one need spiritual direction? Well, because I'm not properly directed. Well, what am I doing when I'm doing spiritual direction? Well, I'm looking at various components, right? It might not have a lot to do with my health of my toe, but I can't exclude my body in this dynamic. So when we talk about deliverance, we talk about wounds, when we talk about healing, understanding the components is very important. And maybe we're not emphasizing all of them at a given point. Like you said, thinking. Bob, we've talked a ton on this podcast about thinking or emotions. And all of those dynamics are at play at any given moment that a human's being a human. Yeah, there's obviously caveats and unique outliers in all these scenarios, but that to me I'm hearing is the general thing. And with that foundation, that's why I think when we talk about deliverance, I have a friend who's a physiotherapist, and he says his job is the evangelization of the body as a physiotherapist. And I love that language. He's trying to bring Christ into a personal connection with the body. And I would say, I do the exact same thing, and we're both dealing with the exact same kind of the exact same reality, which is a person. So it sounds complex, and listeners, you're like, goodness gracious, just go back to the ABCs. Like the point I'm trying to get at is, if we're going to understand and dive into these domains and areas that are very important, we have to understand them to some degree. Otherwise, and this has been my experience, you can get disheartened very quickly because you keep hammering everything as if it's all a nail, and it's not all a nail. And Father, I know for you that you could experience a lot of healing simply from loving someone, as opposed, not in opposition, but maybe that's the remedy instead of, praying a deliverance prayer, right? If you put those side by side, either one of them isn't inherently bad. But if you understand humanity, you can pick the better one for the issue to lead to greater freedom. That's what I'm trying to get at. Is this, Bob, what are you hearing and your thoughts here?
Yeah, my thoughts are many, and I'm going to avoid a deep philosophical discussion here. But a couple of thoughts from Scripture and the Catechism, kind of as it relates to this. I think of when you asked that question about what brings about change, and as you were describing all that, I was thinking of 3 quotes. One is, "Be you transformed by the renewing of your mind," right? Which is connected to the body-soul connection. But as our minds change, what we need deliverance from is a lot of the ways in which our minds have lived in the enemy's lies and desolation that's affected our body, that's affected the way that we live in the world, and vice versa. Then I think about, as you're just talking about love, Jake, I think about the quote in 2 Corinthians 3, I think it's 17, 18, "Be you transformed." No, we are all being transformed from glory to glory as we gaze upon the Lord. And so that relational piece. So a part of it is the transformation of our mind, but a part of it is a transformation of our whole being in relationship to Jesus and in with one another, since we encounter that. And then I think about Catechism talking about the sacraments bring about transformation. And so, again, the sacraments are bodily, touching our senses, but they're also transforming our soul. So, and just put that out there to kind of ground it all in the teaching of the church and the Scripture. And yet, we're dealing with mystery also. I mean, we're dealing with something that's beyond any categories or any definitions, but we're kind of groping in the dark, if you will, with that. So let me bring it back to question. As you're sitting face to face with somebody, Father Boniface, in spiritual direction, let's kind of bring it to that level. What are you attending to, and how are you applying the discerning of spirits, or applying deliverance prayer, unbound prayer, or applying inner healing prayer? Just how does that operate as you're sitting there with somebody face to face and you're having this encounter of love? Can you just describe that some?
Well, if I can just touch on something you said in order to lean into that question, I really appreciate bringing out the relational aspect, which I think is so essential. The formation of our thinking and the formation of our feeling has everything to do with our relationships. So even as I mentioned, we can't think without language. We can't have language without love, because we learn language from another and for communication, and we only learn through trust to actually receive something from another. So the relational dimension of our humanity, I would say, is as integral as body and soul, really. I mean, that we just can't, no more can we separate body from soul than we can separate individual from relationship. And so it's one of my critiques it's one of the things I would like to bring to the conversation of the last 3 folks that you had on, to emphasize that the necessary relational dimension. Ignatius brings it out in the Discernment of Spirits in terms of bringing everything to the spiritual director or the confessor in Rule 13, and the necessity of sharing that, and then a number of points of intersection that the discernment of spirits is really happening in relationship. Of course, unbound is happening in relationship. The exorcism, I think when it's at its best, and I would question whether the solemn rite is even necessary if the relationships are actually working out the right way, but all the same, that relational dimension is so essential. So to bring it down to what that looks like, some simple things that I think about in terms of spiritual direction is that because it's spiritual direction,
Mm.
we both know that, I and the directee, it's already in the context, and Father Tom and I in our book define spiritual direction as a one-on-one relationship in which the primary reference point is the directee's relationship with God. So that's why we're together, is because the directee has a relationship with God, and that's
Mm.
what we're together and about.
Mhm.
But what are we going to get into? Well, the directee's relationship with God is going to develop as the directee's relationship develops with me, the director.
Mm.
And there's going to be a parallel. The things that the directee is comfortable to bring up in spiritual direction and finds a way to put into words, which are going to include those things that they've never told anyone before, the more that we're moving towards that kind of vulnerability, honesty, self-disclosure, even though we're not referencing God directly in those moments, because it's being expressed to the spiritual director, it's going to open the pathway to be able to share that with God. And the spiritual
Mm.
director's responses are going to give some taste of what God's responses are. So,
Mm.
my
Mm.
receiving with love the anxiety or the shamed area of someone's life, or the question that they're bringing up, or the relationship that they're trying to work through, or
Mm.
their own achievements, or any of those things, the way that I receive them is going to give them some sense of how God receives that. And it starts to open up a grammar, it gives vocabulary and experience. And I don't just mean
Mhm.
English vocabulary, but a way of the heart, an expression of the heart that helps that to flow together with God. At times I'll make that explicit and say, especially for a person who maybe struggles with knowing that they're loved, the love that, and I'll know that they're experiencing love in the context of
Mhm.
spiritual direction. And I can say, the love that you're feeling now in our relationship, that's the way that God loves you, and infinitely more and all the time.
Mm.
What you're getting a taste of now is what he wants to give you all the time. But that's the kind of model. So I'm really trying to attend to the heart and trying to love the person as God loves them. And so
Mm.
I'm listening then at different levels for things like spiritual experience as I described it. And sometimes I'll go into those, tell me a little bit more about how it felt when you were praying or when you had this encounter, and listening for those signs of consolation or desolation. In terms of deliverance ministry, what I really like about Unbound is actually the interview and the way that the prayer leader is helping the one receiving prayer to open up certain aspects of their lives. So I sometimes think of Unbound as like spiritual direction light. If you had to pack spiritual direction into an hour and a half, this is a reasonable way to kind of go about it in a kind of targeted fashion. But uh,
Mm.
in spiritual direction, we have the chance to do what Unbound doesn't have the chance to do, which is to show commitment over time, to open up deeper layers, to develop something that's even more relationally strong and affirming, like Conrad Bars talks about emotional affirmation, a kind of emotional foundation of someone's life, which I think would go together with that security that you talk about, Bob,
Mm.
and so that then the maturity can develop, and that develops in the context of the relationship. So now then you might say, why is spiritual direction different than counseling? And I would say simply because it's spiritual direction, because our focus is specifically on the Lord. That's why we're together. And
Mhm.
that's different than the focus of counseling, even though there's lots of overlap in both directions, I would say,
Mm.
in healthy spiritual direction and healthy counseling. So
Mm.
those are the kinds of things I'm really trying to attend to the person's heart, paying attention to where I really want to lead people to greater vulnerability, to share more deeply, to go to the interior, how they're processing things, interpretation, how they're feeling about certain situations, where they're seeing the Lord present in different situations. So just always trying to go to the interior and give them a chance to go deeper and to share that. And the way that I then hold and reverence that is going to open up more paths for their connection with God.
Father, maybe people have intuited it, but you're my spiritual director. So as you're going through this, I've been the recipient of that from you. And so what I can attest to is so many of the things that you have done with me are an integration of these various things. There have been times where I've laughed out loud and you've smiled because the 101 of spirit of discernment of spirits, you were like, it sounds like you're getting gnawed at. And I'm going, oh my gosh, right? Because I completely lost sight of, oh, right. This is not the Lord. It's so obvious. Or it sounds like a young part of you is afraid. And there's an integration of internal family systems or that kind of thing. Or you just smiling, which would be, wow, if he cares about me like this, what does that mean about God's care about me? And so I've firsthand experienced all of those things. And I think what I'm appreciating about what we're doing, and I think what the kind of first half of the episode was trying to do was label that it's very hard to experience healing and reduce humans to siloed aspects of their humanity. You can't just say, oh, all I am is thought, and I'm just going to address my thought, and then everything's going to get better. That's not what it means to be human. And so I remember in clinical training, everybody used to say, what's your clinical orientation or what's your clinical whatever? And the answer everybody felt the pressure to give at the time, and I'm sure it's different now, was, oh, I'm eclectic. And I remember thinking internally, no, you're not allowed to just say that. You actually have to understand the value and how to navigate thoughts, emotions, desires, prayer, if you're coming at it from a Christian perspective, relationship with God, spiritual warfare, because that's human. That's all the stuff that the human faces and deals with. And the ability to navigate all of them is essential. And I appreciate what you said earlier, like, well, you have to specialize at some point. And I would agree. But as a human, every human has to respect their humanity and be eclectic. Otherwise, like you can't just do discernment of spirits. And what I mean by that is you can't just sit there and just discern spirits all day. You're actually supposed to go and actually love somebody too. But in the loving, you'll need the discernment of spirits. And now you might bump into, gosh, this is really hard to love them. Why do I feel so hard to love them? Oh, I have this stronghold in my life that was there from when I was a kid. But what do I do with that? Just discern the spirit? Right? And the point I'm getting at is a well-versed, robust, eclectic, that's where healing is found. That's been my experience of you. And Bob, you would say it as we narrow in, how do you summarize the whole lot of it? Would be love is what heals. That's what I've heard you say. Love is what heals. And the fun part about that is then you go, well, what does that mean? And okay, now we've got to actually define it and lay it out in practical terms. And I think if you listen to our previous guests and what Father Boniface I'm hearing, what I know you to do is, well, it depends on the situation about what healing needs. What does the human person need? Well, it depends. And then you have to know how to do various things. That to me is one of the biggest pitfalls of why people struggle in their own life of restoration. They don't understand that it's not all a one-stop shop, one fixed thing. And so there has to be some rolling with various things. Just like you said, Father, there are times that I've experienced you just listen to me and you were just present to me. And some people go, well, that's inadequate. That you're not really doing anything. Nothing's really happening. Why don't you do something that actually works, right? You could have all those arguments, but if you understand that the human being needs care, then all of a sudden that becomes healing because you understand what the human person's all about. Bob, does it sound like I'm like beating on an idea here and I'm not letting it go? Or
No, I wasn't thinking that.
Okay.
Does that gnaw at you, or is it
Yeah, exactly. It's something's gnawing at me right now. Right. Bob, what thoughts? I'll pass it over to you. Thoughts about all what we're saying in the next step?
I'm actually thinking about an article that Elizabeth in your office, Jake, sent us about trauma and liturgy. And it was a research that was done. And so I don't know why, as you were talking about all that, I started thinking about it, but it's like, what do we need to be delivered from? And how does love play a part of that? Yeah, that's where my mind was going.
There's the question.
People in the article were basically saying the same thing, is that there are some people who can't, because of trauma, because of abuse, and because of the clerical sexual abuse. This is not just the people who have been abused, but a lot of the congregation that in the past could trust the clergy can't now trust the clergy, or can't now trust the liturgy. And the argument they were making, quoting Pope Benedict XVI and quoting St. Augustine, is the trauma can block our capacity to receive the grace. So, like, you may be sitting there, Father Boniface, with Jake at a particular moment, and your heart is just filled with love. But you're seeing and hearing these places that are barriers inside of Jake that aren't able to comprehend and receive those areas of love. And your desire is to love him. And so that's where your comments, Jake, is, it's not just one hammer that fits for one nail, It's like, what are the ways then that love expresses itself when those barriers come up, when that trauma comes up? And I can just say in my own experience, those are some of the most difficult situations of applying any of those tools.
Yes.
It's like, I can have somebody renounce the lie, but if the trauma's there, what happens to them? And so I'm just going to bring that back to you, Father Boniface. Just how do you approach that?
Well, I love that you said that, Bob, because that's one of my concerns and sometimes frustrations with some of those models. Even I wanted to push a little bit when you talked about the being transformed by the renewal of our minds, and cognitive behavioral therapy just doesn't touch trauma. And so much of what people need is the care for places that have been traumatized in their life. And I love, I've gotten so much from The Body Keeps the Score more recently, and then Internal Family Systems, but that notion of attunement, I love that. And Pope Benedict also, in his, he had a meditation for Holy Saturday, and he talked about the way that thoughts don't touch fear, in the sense that, he says, you have a small boy going into a dark woods, no matter how many times you tell him there's nothing there, nothing will take away the fear except a hand to hold his and to walk with him in that place. And so I find myself doing that. I feel like most of the time, it's the most rewarding spiritual direction. I feel like it's most of what I'm doing. It's one thing to explain what God is like. It's another thing to help somebody feel what God is like. And that's going to happen through the attunement of, I'm not just listening, as a matter of fact. And you see that, Jake, when we talk, my face is moving, and there are psychomotor reactions to what you're saying in my little moans, my acknowledges of approval, the way that my smile curls slightly on my, not that I'm thinking of doing any of these things, it's a spontaneous reaction. And I like the way that Conrad Bars described it. He said, affirmation is giving the gift of you back to yourself. That is to say, you're experiencing through me how you are a gift to me in your being, not because of anything you've done for me or because of how you might change or what you might become. You're experiencing how you are a gift to me in this moment. And that comes through those little spontaneous responses and that attunement, which is like a mother does with a baby in its very fundamental way. If you've seen that still face experiment, it's kind of heart-wrenching. The mother stops responding and the baby just goes crazy. But in many ways, that's what trauma is. It's the world has not responded. We tried to cry out, we tried to run or fight, and then nothing worked and we shut down, and it just leaves this broken place in us. And then to learn to attune, and it's like And this is where I like IFS too. It's like a little part of me. There's a little child there that is learning that it's a gift. A little child that's been exiled by a painful experience or, some trauma, and is learning again that part is a gift. And so, and again, in spiritual direction, this is a lot of counseling stuff, but in spiritual direction, it's then connecting with God in a very direct way, because that's who I represent. And that's evident. That's the nature of the context itself. And so I can link that together in an even more immediate way to help that little part that's been traumatized, and sometimes by religious related things. That's what you were talking about, Bob, with the liturgy, and people that have been traumatized by things with religious trappings. And that's the worst. The corruption of the best is the worst. And so how do you free that? Well, I'm clearly representing the church. Nobody sees me, my habit, my beard, and everything else. Nobody knows who I am and comes to me for spiritual direction who doesn't understand that. And there's some healing that can happen, that a new God image can form, or a God image that's more representative of Jesus, who is attuned to our hurts and responds and receives us as a gift and can experience and express that. So, so I think that the caring for trauma is so critical, and especially in these places that can kind of get reduced to cognitive behavioral therapy with some spirituality sprinkled on top.
Yeah. If I can add something as you're saying that, I just reminded me, 2 people received this after going to confession, and it was from Cardinal Ratzinger before he was Pope, Principles of Catholic Theology. And he's talking about what happens when a mother doesn't help a baby turn her cry into a smile. So that simple idea, this is just exactly what you're talking about. Is that, the job of a mother is to help a baby turn her cry into a smile. Right? And what happens to the heart of that child, to the soul of that child, to the body of that child, when that smile isn't turned into it? And what he says is it turns into self-hatred.
Wow.
And that self-hatred becoming shame then blocks the capacity to receive love. And, as you were describing that, I was saying, isn't that beautiful that Cardinal Ratzinger, in talking about theology, is just really bringing it down to that level of human experience, at that most intimate kind of relationship that all of us can relate to. And in a certain sense, as therapists and as spiritual director, we're in the place of the mother or the father, helping that cry turn into a smile just by presence. That's what I'm hearing, to kind of integrate that together.
That's beautiful.
Bob, I would echo, like, as I'm listening and trying to listen for the thread, I think we're on it right here. If we had to put a title to what we're talking about here that maybe is different than the previous guests, is the value none of them are bad. Value discernment of spirits, the value of inner healing prayer, and then deliverance ministry. What I feel like we're talking about right here and today is what actually changes people is relationship. Love is what actually heals people, because we're swimming in water and pointing things out and not naming the water. And the water is the relationship and how that occurs. And if you look at the psychological literature, this is probably some of the most telling meta-analyses of what works in therapy. It keeps coming back to the relationship is what heals. The relation, and the I did my dissertation on part of this was, what actually makes change in therapy. And, I'm dating myself a little bit here, so maybe there's new insights. I don't think that would be the case, but 70% of what accounted for change had nothing to do with the technique. 15% of change had to do with the technique. 70% had to do with the relationship and how the therapist tapped into the relational dynamics within the person. So you could account for 70% of change from the relational components, what I'm saying. That's what I feel like we're saying here, is it's the water we swim in, but we don't name. And if we don't do that well, then you emphasize something and get little incremental 15% moves. But if you do the 70% well and then add the 15, it's significant. And we can't dismiss that. Now, Bob, that's the events that we do together. There's a baseline that rarely gets articulated, which is we're trying to love very well. Then we'll do these other things, and they're efficacious because of the primary mechanism, which is care. And so I'm hearing you, Father Boniface, talk about attunement. And our therapist listeners would know that there's these concepts called mentalization, attachment theory. You look at the work of Dr. Alan Shore. Those kinds of domains are this water that we're describing. And I think that's what I love about what we're saying is we can't miss the articulation of that, because then the human person is out of water, and you might be giving something that's helpful, but to use the analogy of a fish, then it will ultimately need something else. And it's obvious and assumed, right? I actually have had clients, and I remember them vividly when I had a big private practice, numerous clients who would express their deep pain at having to leave Mass right in the middle of it because of being so triggered. And they would come just in pain and saying, what is wrong with me? This is supposed to be the place where I'm supposed to be the safest. I'm supposed to, And just to be able to love them and imagine the scandal, quote unquote, of loving them, saying, it's okay if you go back and sit in your car to regulate yourself. And it's okay if you might not be able to go back in that church. There's a scandal there that I think some people wouldn't be able to understand. And then I would say that's where healing starts to break down. And those are the hills that I start to say, I'll die on that hill. Because if you're not careful, you will shame a person into external behavior, but you won't heal them. They'll never be healed. They'll be shamed into behavior. That's not what Jesus does. Father Boniface, what comes up for you in this as we're talking about these things?
I was just thinking about the necessarily personal dimension of this. I was thinking, these ideas that we're communicating, which are, of course, good information. And Bob and I have written several books. And so because out of the overflow of our relationships and our experience, we want to share that with people. But then there's a temptation, the kind of self-therapy temptation that I can just read a book and then I can fix myself. Mm-hmm. And a book is never going to do attunement in this way, right? There can be some partial attunement. And I was really struck. I had a directee recently talk about reading letters from a Benedictine abbess that were written about a particular subject. And she said, reading those letters, really, like, there was a real attunement that happens, kind of a marvelous thing. She's a cloistered nun, so she doesn't have a lot of opportunities for relationships outside of the cloister. But, that's kind of rare. But I think we try to do that a lot. We're trying to do so much through podcasts and YouTube and books and try to mass, but you can never mass produce this. You can't mass produce attunement. And attunement, I think, is so necessary for healing trauma. And I just think there's so much trauma, big T trauma and little t trauma. It's a lot of, trauma just means wound in Greek. And there's just so many wounds on the heart. So anyway, just reinforcing the personal dimension. That's where I think Pope Francis's call from the Joy of the Gospel, everyone in the church must be introduced into the art of accompaniment. That's what he says. Everyone in the church must be introduced into the art of accompaniment. I think our families and our communities and everything's broken down so much that we're just suffering from so much relational fragmentation, and just learning some attunement can do so much to start bringing some healing to our hearts.
Mm-hmm. You mind, we started, you just referred to it really briefly, but tie that back into deliverance, because I liked what you said of most exorcism, deliverance would not be necessary if this were present. So, kind of connecting back to this whole theme about the spiritual realities and how they connect to this experience of being loved well, and then how that brings about deliverance.
Well, what I appreciate about Neil and Matt's model in Unbound is the emphasis on the relationship between the prayer leader and the one receiving prayer. That, as Neil says, everybody has a story that deserves to be heard, and there are some specific areas they're looking for, places that you're held bound. It's not a general conversation, but it's allowing the person to share their story. So it's getting into the sensitive places in the heart. And the prayer leader is doing attunement with the individual. So there's a real connection there that's not just at the level of thoughts, but at the level of the heart. And then you kind of tag places in the heart in the conversation with names. Can we call that a spirit of self-sufficiency? Can we call that a spirit um, uh, of self-rejection? Can we call that a spirit of distrust? And we're kind of tagging places in the heart. Then it's not just a matter of word manipulation or training the mind or something like that. And then it's also empowering. It's non-confrontational. You're inviting the person to stand empowered in their baptism against these places in them, to forgive, to repent, to renounce. And so that empowerment that happens, and I'm doing that with you. So again, that attunement and that relationality is really helping the person to become more alive through the relationship. And then, as I said, the limitation in my mind is, of course, the relationship is for an hour and a half, and your prayer leaders are going to be variously well formed to be able to do all of these things. But it's creating, I think, the best structure I know of. Other forms of deliverance ministry are either confrontational. The prayer leader is going to come in and cast out your demons using kind of prayers. And I don't doubt the spiritual efficacy of prayers, but as you said earlier, they need to be received. Even the solemn rite of exorcism is only a sacramental. I mean, it's like a blessing or holy water, everything else, that it's only received according to the receiver. And in fact, even the faith of the receiver, as well as the faith of the one praying. So the models of exorcism that have taken on medical models of disconnection, that the exorcist is like a surgeon applying weapons of certain prayers and rites in order to achieve an effect in the one who is struggling with being possessed or oppressed. I have a lot of concerns around all of that. I think that it's really losing this relational element. I'll say in contrast, so I went to a school where they formed exorcists, and we had professors from the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they have a very strong sense, at least as these ones were. I don't have direct experience of this, but they described surrounding the person with a community of support, and doing a lot of work on forgiveness and really working the heart, strengthening the relationships, building up the person. And then if there were specific places that they felt the rites of the church could have some positive effect, to remove the third eye or to reverse the effects of certain things, or that it was bringing it into the church's rites, but it was bringing it from a strongly relational context into the church's rites in very specific ways, and then after that also in a relational context. And so they might apply the solemn rite a couple of times, as opposed to the American or the European model, which is often repeated weekly, even for years. And so to emphasize, this is the point that I want to make. I'm not going to comment on all of those things or claim myself the expert in all of those areas, but I do see the essential importance in our humanity. So I mentioned my one big theme is humanity. I love our humanity. I don't want to spiritually bypass our emotions and our thoughts, our psychology, our feel, all of these things, and relationality. Those are the two things that I emphasize in our spiritual direction school, and that I think are just so important for, I just think, all of us to keep growing in learning relationships and loving humanity and all of our poverty and littleness and woundedness and all of these things. There's just so much beautiful humanity that God loves so much. And so we should too.
Amen.
Amen.
Father, I think that's a great place to pause. I love the summary, and I love you and appreciate our relationship and all the ways that you've blessed me. So listeners, I want to remind you again to check out Father Boniface. You just type in Father Boniface Hicks into Amazon. You'll see the books pop up. The Institute of Ministry Formation. Maybe you feel called to be a spiritual director and you want to begin a school of formation. I really appreciate Father Boniface's school. It allows a person like me, a working individual, to be able to do ongoing formation, and it's digestible. And so I've appreciated, Father Boniface, how you've structured that. And Father Boniface has a lot of resources out there that are available to you that listeners, I would encourage you to check out. Father, thanks for being with us. We appreciate that you've joined us, and we're really, really grateful for all the things that you do. So thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Father Boniface. It's always a gift to be together with you.
It's such a joy to be with both of you. I'm so grateful for the beautiful work you're doing. It's a joy to be on your team.
Amen. Listeners, we hope this blessed you, and we'll talk to you again soon.